There is a cave in the mountains of Abkhazia that drops more than 2 kilometers straight into the earth. To reach the bottom, a team has to descend for days, sleeping in tents pitched on ledges above black shafts. In 2018, a group of Russian explorers reached the deepest point ever touched by a human being, and then the water came. In a matter of hours, the flooded passages behind them rose faster than anyone thought possible, and the expedition became a race back toward the surface, upward through a mountain that was filling like a bottle. In the jungles of southern Mexico, there is a shaft so deep that the divers who explore its flooded floor are farther from daylight than almost anyone on the planet. One of them died down there in 1994. His body was recovered from a passage that no one had ever mapped, in water so far below the surface that the rescue itself was a world record. In the Alps, there is a cave that was explored backwards. For decades, cavers pushed down from an entrance high in the mountains, while another team crawled up from a spring far below, both chasing the same empty space in the middle. When the two halves finally met, they had connected one of the deepest voids in Europe, and they still do not fully agree on how the water moves through it. And in the same small corner of the Caucasus, 4 of the 10 deepest caves on Earth sit within a few miles of each other, in a block of white limestone that behaves in ways geologists are still trying to understand. This is our countdown of the 10 deepest caves ever explored, the places where the maps simply stop and where even seasoned scientists have admitted they do not know what lies below. Stay until the end, because number 1 is that Abkhazian cave, the deepest known point on the planet, and what happens there every year still catches expeditions by surprise. Before we start, drop a comment telling us where you are watching from right now. We want to see how far down this list reaches. Number 10. Sistema Huautla, Oaxaca, Mexico. At 1,560 meters, roughly 5,118 feet, it is the deepest cave in the entire Western Hemisphere. For half a century, explorers have been pushing into the Huautla Plateau, a green, rain-soaked highland in southern Mexico where the rock is so riddled with holes that whole rivers vanish into the ground. The exploration began in the 1960s, and it has never really stopped. Generation after generation of cavers has returned, connecting separate entrances scattered across the plateau into one enormous system, so that a person can now enter through one hole in the mountains and, in theory, travel underground for miles before reaching the deep flooded heart of the cave. What makes Huautla different from the caves higher on this list is water. The deep sections are not simply steep, they are flooded. To go deeper, cavers have to become cave divers, carrying tanks through submerged tunnels called sumps, where a single wrong turn in zero visibility can be fatal. And cave diving at that depth is one of the most dangerous pursuits a human being can attempt. There is no swimming to the surface. Above the diver is not open water but solid rock, and the only way out is to retrace the exact route back, often through silt-choked passages where the water turns to brown fog the moment a fin touches the floor. Divers navigate by touch, following a thin guideline through the dark, knowing that panic or a lost line means death. In 1994, during an expedition led by the American explorer Bill Stone, a British diver named Ian Rowland died at extreme depth, and recovering him became one of the deepest body recoveries ever attempted. To understand what these divers face, consider the numbers. At the bottom of Huautla, they are more than 1.5 kilometers below the entrance, breathing from tanks, in water near freezing, sometimes hours of travel from the nearest air. There is no quick way out. If something goes wrong at that depth, the surface might as well be another planet. The full extent of the flooded passages beyond the final sump has never been mapped. How much deeper Huautla goes is still, in the explorer's own words, an open question, and every expedition that returns adds a little more to a map that has no clear edge. Number 9. Hirlatzhöhle, Austria. Reaching about 1,560 meters, It is one of the longest cave systems in Austria, threaded beneath the Dachstein Massif in a tangle of passages that stretches for more than 100 kilometers. Hirlatzhöhle is a maze, and that is exactly the problem. Surveyors have spent decades mapping it, and every year the known length grows because the passages branch and loop and double back in ways that make it almost impossible to say where the system ends. In a vertical cave, depth is at least a clear goal. You go down until you cannot go further. In a maze cave like Hirlatzhöhle, there is no single bottom to reach, only an endless three-dimensional puzzle of tunnels stacked above and below one another. A surveyor can spend a full day underground and add only a few hundred meters of new passage to a map that already runs for 100 kilometers and still walk out knowing that dozens of unexplored leads were left behind in the dark. Geologists know the water that carved it drains toward the valley below, but the precise route it takes through the mountain has never been fully traced. Explorers describe entire regions of the cave that have been entered once and never revisited, side passages noted on a survey and then left alone for years because there is always somewhere else to push. This is the quiet truth of the world's great cave systems. They are not conquered in a single heroic trip. They are assembled slowly, over decades, by people who accept that they will never see the whole thing and that the map they are drawing will still be incomplete when they hand it to the next generation. It is deep, it is vast, and large parts of it remain, in a very literal sense, unexplored. Number 8. Sistema del Cerro del Cuevón, Spain. At 1,589 meters, this system lies in the Picos de Europa, a range of limestone peaks in northern Spain that has quietly become one of the most important cave regions on Earth. The Picos are riddled with deep shafts because the rock is pure, soluble limestone lifted high into the mountains, which gives water an enormous vertical distance to cut downward. Rain and snowmelt land on the bare limestone summits, find a crack, and begin a journey straight down through the heart of the range. Over hundreds of thousands of years, that water carves vertical shafts, some of them hundreds of feet deep in a single unbroken drop. Cerro del Cuevón is a product of that geology, a cave that does not wind gently downward but plunges through the mountain in a staircase of pits, each one lowered on ropes into darkness that swallows the beam of a headlamp. Teams from across Europe return here summer after summer, connecting smaller caves into the larger system. And the central mystery of the Picos remains unsolved. The water that vanishes into these high entrances reappears in springs far below, sometimes more than a kilometer lower and kilometers away, but the underground rivers linking them have never been completely followed. Cavers have spent lifetimes chasing those connections, and much of the deep plumbing of the Picos de Europa is still, quite literally, a blank space on the map. If you are still with us, we are about to leave the mountains of Western Europe and return to the two regions that dominate this list, the French Alps and the Caucasus. Take a moment to hit subscribe, because the deeper we go, the stranger the water becomes. Numbers 7 through 1 are where the record itself was made and broken. Number 7. Gouffre, Jean-Bernard, France. At 1,617 meters, this cave in the French Alps once held the title of the deepest in the world. Through the 1970s and 1980s, French cavers pushed it deeper and deeper, connecting several entrances high in the Alps into one system and lowering the record with almost every major expedition. For years, it was the benchmark against which every other deep cave in the world was measured, the cave that defined what deep even meant. But Jean-Bernard has a darker reputation as well. Its lower passages flood violently and without warning when snowmelt or rain surges through the mountain, and cavers have died there, trapped by rising water in sections that were dry only hours before. The behavior of the water inside Jean-Bernard is notoriously difficult to predict, which is precisely why parts of it are approached with such caution. A passage that a team walks through in the morning can become an impassable, roaring flood by afternoon, sealed off by water that pushes through the mountain far faster than the rain seems to justify. Cavers have learned to read the sky before they descend, and even then, the connection between weather on the surface and water deep inside remains only roughly understood. Even now, the timing of its floods is something explorers respect rather than fully predict. Number 6. Gouffre Mirolda, France. At 1,733 meters, Mirolda, also in the Huautla region of the French Alps, is one of a small handful of caves to have briefly claimed the record as the deepest on Earth. For a short time around the turn of the century, French survey teams pushed its depth past every rival and placed it at the very top of the global list before deeper measurements in the Caucasus overtook it. That back and forth is not unusual. For much of the last 50 years, the title of deepest cave has passed between France, Austria, and the Caucasus, changing hands every time a team squeezed through one more constriction or pushed one more shaft to its floor. Mirolda is a reminder of how uncertain these numbers really are. A cave's depth is not a fixed fact carved in stone. It is a figure that shifts every time a new passage is found or an old survey is corrected. Depths are measured underground with hand instruments, laser rangefinders, inclinometers, and careful notes, all carried through mud and water by tired people working by lamplight. A resurvey years later can move the official number by tens of meters in either direction. So when you see a cave ranked to the exact meter, remember that the figure is really the best estimate of a small group of humans who crawled to the lowest point they could reach and measured back up to the entrance. The bottom of Mirolda sits in cold, remote galleries that take a serious expedition just to visit, and the question of whether it connects to other voids in the same massif has never been settled. Number 5. Lamprechtsofen, Austria. At 1,735 meters, this Austrian cave was explored in one of the strangest ways in the history of speleology. Instead of going down from the top, cavers went up from the bottom. The main entrance sits low in a valley, where a powerful spring pours out of the mountainside. And for years teams pushed upward through the system, climbing toward high entrances far above. In 1998, a Polish and Austrian effort finally connected the cave to shafts near the summit, and its full depth was revealed all at once. Imagine the strangeness of that. For years, one team is inching upward through flooded galleries from the valley spring, while another is descending from the peaks above, and neither can be certain the two spaces will ever join. Then, on one expedition, a caver pushes through a final passage and realizes the emptiness ahead is the same emptiness the other team has been mapping from above. The mountain becomes one cave. Lamprechtsofen is essentially an entire massif turned into a single plumbing system, water entering high on the peaks and emerging, sometimes days later, at the base. But how quickly that water travels and through which passages is still only partly mapped, because much of the flooded interior can never be safely entered. Number 4. Snezhnaya, in the Arabica and Bazib massifs of Abkhazia. At 1,760 meters, Snezhnaya, whose name comes from the Russian word for snow, earned it honestly. Near its upper entrance sits a permanent plug of ice and packed snow, and the cave stays brutally cold throughout. Soviet and Russian cavers spent decades exploring it, beginning in the 1970s, and it was for a long time considered the most demanding cave expedition in the world, a proving ground where entire teams disappear underground for weeks at a time. The logistics alone are staggering. Everything a team needs, food, fuel, sleeping gear, rope, has to be carried down by hand and cached at underground camps, and everything has to come back out again. There are no shortcuts, no way to be quickly rescued, no daylight to break the routine. The cave is fed by meltwater that pours through it, and the volume can be overwhelming, turning parts of the descent into a fight against cold and rushing water at the same time. Expeditions here can last 3 weeks or more without ever seeing the sun, and the psychological weight of that isolation is as serious as the physical danger. What lies at the very bottom of Snezhnaya, and whether it links underground to the other giant systems nearby, remains one of the open puzzles of Caucasus cave science, a puzzle that has cost the exploration community both decades and lives to chip away at. Number 3. Sarma, Abkhazia. At 1,830 meters, Sarma sits in the same extraordinary region as the two caves above it, the Arabica Massif, on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. And here we reach the heart of the mystery that ties this whole area together. 4 of the 10 deepest caves on Earth are clustered in this one block of limestone. The reason is a combination of factors geologists are still working out: pure soluble rock, a mountain lifted high above sea level, and a strange plumbing system that appears to carry water from these peaks to springs deep beneath the Black Sea itself. During the last ice ages, sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet, and each time they dropped, the water inside the Arabica Massif had further to fall, cutting the caves deeper and deeper over hundreds of thousands of years. The result is a block of mountain that acts like a giant, ancient drain, one whose full inner shape no one has ever seen. Dye traces, where researchers pour a harmless colored marker into the water and wait to see where it surfaces, have shown water from the Arabica Massif emerging from springs on the Black Sea coast and even from vents on the sea floor below sea level. That means the caves of Arabica may drain in ways that defy the simple picture of water always flowing downhill to the nearest valley. The system appears to plunge below the level of the sea itself before rising again. Exactly how deep that hidden circulation goes, no one has confirmed, because the passages that carry it are flooded and beyond human reach. Sarma is one window into that system, and its lower reaches are still being pushed by teams who suspect the mountain hides more than it has shown. Number 2. Krubera-Voronja, Abkhazia. At 2,199 meters, roughly 7,215 feet, Krubera was the first cave ever proven to exceed 2,000 meters in depth, and for years it was the undisputed deepest on Earth. Named after the Russian geographer Alexander Krubera, it was pushed to its record depths through the 1990s and 2000s, largely by the Ukrainian speleologist Alexander Klimchuk and the teams he organized. Their campaigns read less like weekend caving and more like siege warfare against a mountain, expedition after expedition, each one pushing a little further past the last known point, rigging ropes down shafts that had never felt a human hand. Krubera was the cave that first shattered the 2,000-meter barrier, a depth that many had quietly doubted any cave on Earth could reach. Reaching that depth is an expedition of many days, hauling gear down a vertical world of ropes, cold, and darkness, sleeping in underground camps thousands of feet below the surface. At the very bottom lies a flooded chamber, and in 2012, the Ukrainian cave diver Gennady Samokhin descended into that terminal sump and set the depth record that stood for years. But even Krubera's floor is not truly the end. Samokhin did not just reach the sump, he dived into it, swimming down into the flooded terminal chamber to extend the record even further, farther below the surface of the Earth than almost any human had ever been while still inside a cave. And even then, the sump continued beyond where he could go, into water-filled passages that no human has ever seen. Klimchuk and others have long suspected that Krubera connects, somewhere in the drowned rock, to the wider Arabica system that drains toward the sea. If that is true, the true bottom of the cave is not a place a person can stand at all. The cave's real depth is defined not by its floor, but by the limit of human endurance. And number 1. Veryovkina, Abkhazia, the deepest known cave on Earth. At 2,212 meters, more than 7,250 feet, it is nearly 7 times the height of the Eiffel Tower, straight down. Veryovkina was first found in 1968, but for half a century it kept its real depth hidden. Early expeditions reached only a few hundred meters before the passages seemed to end. It was not until Russian teams returned again and again, decades later, squeezing through tight meanders and rigging shaft after shaft, that the cave suddenly opened up and plunged. In 2018, one of those teams finally reached the bottom, and in doing so, touched the deepest point ever accessed by a human being anywhere on the planet. And it was there, at the lowest point ever touched by human beings, that the cave revealed its most dangerous secret. In September 2018, an expedition camped deep inside was hit by a sudden, catastrophic flood. Water surged up through the lower passages with almost no warning, driven by rain falling on the mountain far above, and the team had to abandon everything and climb for their lives, racing upward through a system that was filling beneath them. They climbed for hours through darkness, past the camp they had abandoned, past gear now underwater, not knowing whether the flood would rise faster than they could move. They survived. But the event proved something the numbers alone cannot. These caves are not static holes in the ground. They are living hydraulic systems, and the bottom of the deepest one on Earth can turn from a campsite into a death trap in a matter of hours. The team lost cameras, tents, and equipment to the water, but they walked away with something rarer, direct proof of how alive these caves really are. A flood like that does not announce itself. Rain on the surface, sometimes far from the entrance, feeds into the mountain and arrives at the bottom with a force and speed that no one at the deep camp can predict from below. What sits beneath Veryovkina's final sump, how far the flooded passages reach, and whether an even deeper cave is waiting somewhere in the same block of Caucasus limestone are questions no one can yet answer. The deepest known point on Earth is not the end of anything. It is simply the deepest place a human being has so far managed to reach and return from alive. 10 caves and one strange truth running through all of them. A shaft in Mexico whose flooded floor has never been mapped. A maze under Austria that grows every year. A Spanish system whose rivers vanish and reappear miles away. An alpine cave that floods without warning, and another explored from the bottom up. A frozen Russian giant, and a cluster of 4 record-breaking voids in a single block of Caucasus limestone that appears to drain beneath the sea. And at the very bottom of the list, the 2 deepest caves on Earth where the true floor is not rock at all, but water no human has ever passed. There is something humbling in that. We have stood on the summit of Everest and sent machines to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, and yet the deepest caves on Earth are still being explored the old way, by people crawling into them 1 meter at a time. No drone can fly these passages, no satellite can map them. The knowledge exists only because someone was willing to spend weeks underground, in the cold and the dark and the wet, to find out what was there. And every one of these 10 caves ends not with an answer, but with a question, a flooded passage, an untraced river, a lead left for next year. The maps all trail off into the same phrase, written in the margins of survey notebooks around the world. Continues, not explored. The deepest points on this planet are not on any mountain or in any ocean trench we can casually visit. They are here, beneath our feet in the dark, still being measured. Which of these caves would you descend into if you had the chance, and which one would you never enter no matter the reward? Let us know in the comments. And if this took you somewhere you have never been, subscribe and stay with us as we keep going deeper.